Titanic was called.
Do you trust me?
I'm flying! Jack!
To make each day count.
I'll never let go, Jack.
What made Titanic one of the greatest movies of all time? In this video, I'll reveal amazing facts, hidden details, and review the unforgettable love story of Jack and Rose aboard the legendary Titanic. Stay till the end for emotional moments and surprising facts, only on Sonu Hub. Completely different social classes who fall in love during the ship's first and only voyage. The movie also features a talented cast, including Billy Zane, Kathy Bates, Francis Fisher, Bernard Hill, Jonathan Hyde, Danny Nucci, David Warner, and Bill Paxton. James Cameron came up with the idea because he had always been fascinated by shipwrecks, especially the Titanic. He believed that telling a powerful love story alongside the real life tragedy would help people connect with the emotional side of the disaster. Production officially started on September 1, 1995, when Cameron filmed the actual Titanic wreck deep in the Atlantic Ocean. The present day scenes were filmed aboard the research ship Academic Mstislav Keldysh, owned by the Shirshov Institute of Oceanology, which Cameron also used as his base while exploring the wreck. To recreate the Titanic, the filmmakers used detail scale models, advanced CGI, and a huge life-size reconstruction of the ship built at Baja Studios. The movie was originally being developed by 20th Century Fox, but because the production kept getting delayed and the budget kept getting bigger, Fox teamed up with Paramount Pictures to help pay for the film. At the time, Titanic became the most expensive movie ever made, with a production budget of around $200 million. Filming lasted from July 1996 until March 1997. Titanic had its world premiere at the Tokyo International Film Festival on November 1, 1997, before opening in theaters across the United States on December 19, 1997. Paramount Pictures distributed the movie in the United States and Canada, while 20th Century Fox handled the release in the rest of the world. The film received huge praise from both critics and audiences for its groundbreaking visual effects, amazing performances, especially from Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, and Gloria Stewart, as well as its incredible production design, James Cameron's direction, unforgettable music, beautiful cinematography, emotional story, and powerful storytelling. At the 70th Academy Awards, the movie earned 14 Oscar nominations and won 11 awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. It tied the record for the most Oscar nominations with All About Eve and matched Ben-Hur for the most Academy Awards won by a single movie. Later on, La La Land matched the nomination record. The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King matched the win record, and the nomination record was eventually broken by Sinners when it first hit theaters. Titanic earned more than $1.84 billion worldwide, making it the first movie in history to cross the incredible $1 billion mark at the global box office. It also became the highest grossing movie of all time and held that record until James Cameron's next blockbuster, Avatar 2009, passed it in 2010. Besides its huge box office success, the movie made billions more from home video sales, soundtrack albums, and television broadcast rights in the United States. Thanks to several re-releases over the years, Titanic has earned around $2.264 billion worldwide, making it only the second movie ever to pass the $2 billion mark after Avatar. As of 2023, it remains one of the four highest grossing movies ever made. In 2017, the Library of Congress added Titanic to the United States National Film Registry because of its cultural, historical, and artistic importance, making sure the film will be preserved for future generations. In 1996, treasure hunter Brock Lovett, Bill Paxton, and his team are aboard the research ship Academic Mstislav Keldysh, exploring the wreck of the RMS Titanic. Their mission is to find a priceless blue diamond necklace known as the Heart of the Ocean. The Titanic lies about 3,821 meters below the ocean's surface. During the search, they recover the safe belonging to Khaled and Cal Hockley, Billy Zane, hoping the famous necklace is locked inside. Instead, they discover a drawing of a naked young woman wearing the heart of the ocean. The sketch is dated April 14, 1912. The same night, the Titanic struck the iceberg. Since Brock's expedition is being paid for by private investors, he is under a lot of pressure to find the diamond. After seeing the drawing on the TV news, an elderly woman named Rose Dawson Calvert, Gloria Stewart contacts Brock and says she is the woman in the sketch. Rose, now 101 years old, arrives on Brock's salvage ship with her granddaughter, Lizzie Calvert Susie Amis. After hearing her story and seeing how much she knows about the Titanic, Brock realizes she really was on the ship that night and was the last person ever seen wearing the heart of the ocean. He also knows that Carl's father had already collected the insurance money for the missing diamond before the Titanic even left England to help explain what happened. Brock shows Rose a computer simulation of the Titanic crashing into the iceberg. The iceberg scraped along the ship's starboard side, tearing open several sections of the hull. Water quickly rushed into multiple watertight compartments. As those compartments filled up, the water spilled over the bulkheads because they didn't extend higher than E deck. This caused the ship's bow to sink deeper while the stern slowly lifted into the air. Eventually, the Titanic snapped into two pieces. The front half disappeared beneath the ocean first, followed by the back half a short time later. The ship finally sank at 2:20 a.m., about 2 hours and 40 minutes after hitting the iceberg. When Brock asks Rose if she knows where the necklace is, she begins remembering her past and reveals that she is actually Rose DeWitt Bukater, a first-class passenger who everyone believed had died in the disaster. Rose begins telling her incredible story. Back in 1912, 17-year-old Rose DeWitt Bukater, Kate Winslet, boards the Titanic in Southampton with her wealthy fiancé, Cal Hockley, and her mother, Ruth DeWitt Bukater, Frances Fisher. The Titanic is leaving on its very first voyage and is proudly being called an unsinkable ship. Ruth constantly reminds Rose that marrying Carl is extremely important because their family is secretly broke and the marriage will save their social status and financial future. At the same time, Jack Dawson Leonardo DiCaprio and his best friend Fabrizio Danny Nucci barely make it onto the ship after winning third-class tickets in a poker game against a group of Irish immigrants. Wealthy passenger Margaret Molly Brown Kathy Bates also boards the ship in Cherbourg. Even though she is rich, many of the old money first class passengers look down on her because they consider her new money. The following day, the Titanic sails across the Atlantic at about 21 knots. The ship is commanded by Captain Edward John Smith Bernard Hill and was designed by Thomas Andrews Victor Garber. The bridge crew includes Chief Officer Henry Wild, Mark Lindsay Chapman, First Officer William Murdoch, Ewan Stewart, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, Jonathan Phillips, and Third Officer Herbert Pittman, Kevin Delanoy, J. Bruce Ismay, Jonathan Hyde. The managing director of the White Star Line is also on board and wants the voyage to be remembered as a huge success. Feeling trapped in a life she doesn't want, Rose becomes overwhelmed and decides she would rather die than marry Cole. She walks to the back of the ship and climbs over the railing, thinking about jumping into the freezing ocean. Just before she falls, a young artist named Jack Dawson notices her and talks her out of it. When Rose slips, Jack grabs her and pulls her safely back onto the deck. Other passengers quickly arrive and misunderstand what happened. Rose tells Cal that she was simply leaning over the railing out of curiosity and that Jack saved her from falling. Grateful for what he believes Jack did, Cal invites him to join them for dinner the following evening. That same night, Cal gives Rose an expensive engagement gift, the Heart of the Ocean diamond necklace. Meanwhile, Bruce Ismay pushes Captain Smith to light the last four boilers and make the Titanic go even faster. Despite receiving several warnings about icebergs in the ship's path, Ismay wants the Titanic to arrive in New York earlier than expected, so the voyage will make headlines around the world. Rose also notices something troubling. The ship carries lifeboats for only about half of the passengers on board. Thomas Andrews explains that more lifeboats were suggested, but they were rejected because they would make the ship's decks look too crowded and less attractive. As the days pass, Jack and Rose slowly become friends. Rose learns that Jack is a talented artist who earns money by drawing portraits, especially nude sketches. Although Cal and Bruce strongly disapprove of Rose spending time with someone from third class, she feels happier around Jack than she ever has before. After attending the fancy first class dinner, Rose secretly sneaks away and joins Jack at a lively third class party. She dances, laughs, drinks, and enjoys Irish music for the first time in years. For the first time in a long while, she truly feels free and alive. When Cal and Ruth discover what's happening, they order Rose to stay away from Jack. Cal even slaps Rose when she tries to stand up for herself. At first, Rose tries to push Jack away, but she soon realizes she is deeply in love with him instead of Cole. The two meet at the front of the ship during the Titanic's final sunset, where Jack encourages Rose to stand at the bow with her arms stretched out as if she is flying. Later, Rose brings Jack to her private cabin and asks him to draw her wearing nothing except the Heart of the Ocean necklace. After finishing the sketch, the two escape from Cole's bodyguard, Spicer Lovejoy, David Warner, and hide inside a car stored in the ship cargo hold, where they become lovers. After leaving the cargo area, Jack and Rose walk onto the forward well deck just as the Titanic crashes into the iceberg. Because the sea is completely calm that night, the iceberg isn't spotted until it's almost too late. The crew doesn't have enough time to turn the giant ship away. Instead of hitting the iceberg head on, which might have caused less damage, the Titanic scrapes along its starboard side, ripping open several parts of the hull. The officers immediately seal all the watertight doors up to E deck. Jack and Rose overhear Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, and the ship's officers discussing the terrible situation. Rose rushes to warn her mother, and Carl Andrews explains that 5 watertight compartments have been flooded. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat with only 4 flooded compartments, so flooding 5 means the ship is doomed. According to Andrews, the Titanic has no more than 2 hours left before it sinks. There are around 1,200 people on board, and Captain Smith immediately orders the wireless operators to send out a distress signal with the ship's location. Sadly, the closest ship is still about 4 hours away, making rescue impossible before the Titanic disappears beneath the sea. Casting Leonardo DiCaprio as Jack Dawson represented one of the most pivotal and closely scrutinized casting decisions in the production of the 1997 film. At the time of casting, DiCaprio was 21 years old and already possessed a growing reputation from roles in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, for which he received an Academy Award nomination, and Romeo plus Juliet. Casting director Marley Finn first brought him to the attention of director James Cameron. Established names including Matthew McConaughey, Chris O'Donnell, Billy Crudup, Stephen Dorff, Tom Cruise, Jared Leto, Jeremy Sisto, Mark Wahlberg, Ethan Hawke, Christian Bale, and Paul Rudd had all been discussed or had auditioned in some capacity. Cameron considered many of these actors too mature in appearance or demeanor for a character intended to be roughly 20 years old. Tom Cruise expressed interest, yet his salary demands proved prohibitive. Jared Leto declined to audition. Billy Crudup was shortlisted and invited to test, but ultimately passed in favor of another project. Matthew McConaughey read with Kate Winslet, yet Cameron found his southern accent incompatible with the character and the actor declined to modify it. The process with DiCaprio itself nearly collapsed. After an initial meeting that charmed the production office staff, so many female colleagues crowded into the conference room that Cameron found the situation amusing. DiCaprio was invited back for a chemistry test with Winslet, who had already been cast. Unaware that a formal reading was required, DiCaprio arrived expecting only a conversation. When Cameron announced that they would run lines on camera, DiCaprio stated that he did not read. Cameron shook his hand and indicated the meeting was over. DiCaprio then reconsidered, asking whether refusal meant he would lose the part. Cameron confirmed that the scale of the production, which would consume 2 years of his own life, demanded certainty in casting, and that DiCaprio would either read or forfeit consideration. DiCaprio proceeded with evident reluctance, his demeanor remaining negative until the moment Cameron called action. At that point, he transformed fully into the character of Jack. Winslet responded with equal intensity, and the scene developed a palpable energy. Cameron later described the shift as clouds parting and a ray of light illuminating the performance, after which he knew DiCaprio was the correct choice. The studio had reservations about DiCaprio's bankability at the time, requiring Cameron to advocate strongly on his behalf. Kate Winslet as Rose DeWitt Bukater was secured through a combination of her own determination and a decisive audition. Cameron initially envisioned an Audrey Hepburn type and had considered Gwyneth Paltrow, Winona Ryder, Claire Danes, Gabrielle Anwar, and Reese Witherspoon. Winslet, then in her early 20s and known for period work in Sense and Sensibility, Jude, and Hamlet, risked being typecast as cossetic Kate. Finn again suggested her. Winslet herself pursued the role aggressively. After reading the script, she telephoned Cameron, interrupted him on the freeway, and declared that she had to play the part and that he would be mistaken not to cast her. Her audition proved exceptional. Once attached, she further advocated for DiCaprio, tracking him down at the Cannes Film Festival and insisting that she would not proceed without him. The resulting chemistry between the two leads became central to the film's emotional core. Billy Zane as Caledon Call Hockley filled the role of Rose's wealthy and controlling fiancé. Several other actors had been under consideration, among them Michael Biehn, who attended multiple meetings with Cameron, as well as Pierce Brosnan, Rupert Everett, Peter Green, William Hurt, Jason Isaacs, Rob Lowe, Matthew McConaughey, again in a different context, Adrian Paul, and Rufus Sewell. Zane's casting brought a polished, aristocratic presence that contrasted sharply with DiCaprio's working-class Jack, reinforcing the class tensions that drive much of the narrative conflict. Kathy Bates as Margaret Molly Brown provided a grounded, outspoken counterpoint among the first-class passengers. Bates, already an established Academy Award winner, brought both comic relief and moral clarity to the character of the unsinkable Molly Brown, a historical figure known for her resilience and independence. Her performance required navigating both the opulent social scenes and the later chaos of the sinking, while maintaining a distinctive American vigor amid predominantly British or upper-class accents. Frances Fisher as Ruth DeWitt Bukater embodied the rigid social expectations of the period. As Rose's mother, Fisher portrayed a woman whose own financial security depended on her daughter's advantageous marriage, creating a complex antagonist who is simultaneously protective and oppressive. The role demanded a precise balance of maternal concern and cold pragmatism, qualities Fisher delivered with understated intensity. Gloria Stewart as Old Rose completed the framing device that links the 1912 story to the present-day expedition. Stewart, a veteran of Hollywood's golden age, whose career stretched back to the 1930s, was in her mid-80s at the time of filming. Her casting lent authenticity and emotional weight to the elderly survivor's narration and final scenes. The decision to use an actress of her generation rather than aging a younger performer through makeup reinforced the film's commitment to historical and emotional verisimilitude. Stewart's quiet dignity and the quiet power of her closing moments became one of the production's most memorable elements. Bill Paxton as Brock Lovett anchored the contemporary treasure hunting sequences. Paxton, a frequent collaborator with Cameron from earlier films such as Aliens and True Lies, brought a mixture of professional determination and eventual humility to the role of the expedition leader, whose initial greed gives way to genuine respect for the human story of the disaster. His presence provided continuity within Cameron's informal repertory company and helped ground the modern framing narrative. Bernard Hill as Captain Edward John Smith carried the historical weight of the ship's master. Hill's portrayal emphasized both the quiet authority expected of a senior White Star Line commander and the growing awareness of catastrophe. The role required careful calibration. Smith is neither villain nor pure hero, but a professional whose decisions unfold under mounting pressure. Hill's measured performance avoided caricature while conveying the gravity of command. David Warner as Spicer Lovejoy served as Call's valet and enforcer. Warner's long career in both stage and screen roles equipped him to deliver a coolly efficient antagonist whose loyalty to his employer remains absolute until the final moments. The character functions as an extension of Call's will, and Warner's understated menace amplified the class and power dynamics without descending into melodrama. Victor Garber as Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, offered a portrait of professional pride mixed with quiet despair. Garber's performance traced Andrews' journey from confident architect showing Rose the ship's plans to a man who understands earlier than most that the vessel is doomed. His scenes with Winslet in particular underscored the human cost of the engineering failure. Jonathan Hyde as J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, navigated a historically contentious figure. Hyde portrayed Ismay's combination of commercial ambition and eventual moral reckoning. The role required conveying both the public face of corporate confidence and the private weight of responsibility once the collision occurs. Susie Amis as Lizzie Calvert, Old Rose's granddaughter, provided a contemporary emotional anchor in the framing story. Amis's scenes with Stewart helped bridge the decades and gave the modern sequences a familial warmth that balanced the technical focus of the expedition. Louis Abernathy as Louis Bodine and Nicholas Casconi as Bobby Buell populated the research vessel with supporting voices that supplied exposition and occasional levity. Anatoly M. Sagalevich, a real-life deep ocean researcher, appeared as Anatoly Milkelavich, adding documentary authenticity to the present-day sequences through his actual expertise with submersibles. Danny Nucci as Fabrizio De Rossi and Jason Barry as Tommy Ryan formed Jack's circle of third-class friends. Nucci's Italian immigrant and Barry's Irish passenger illustrated the ethnic diversity and camaraderie of stage life. Their scenes of music, dancing, and eventual tragedy grounded the film's depiction of the lower decks. The ship's officers were cast with careful attention to historical accuracy and dramatic function. Ewan Stewart as First Officer William Murdoch, Ewan Grafford as Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, Johnny Phillips as Second Officer Charles Lightoller, Mark Lindsay Chapman as Chief Officer Henry Wilde, Richard Graham as Quartermaster George Rowe, and Paul Brightwell as Quartermaster Robert Higgins. Each embodied specific documented personalities and actions from the night of the sinking. Ron Bonacci as the Master-at-Arms represented shipboard authority in the lower decks. These roles demanded both technical precision in the depiction of emergency procedures and the ability to convey individual moral choices under extreme stress. Historical first-class passengers received equally careful casting. Eric Braeden as Colonel John Jacob Astor Fair and Charlotte Chatton as Madeline Astor portrayed one of the era's most prominent couples. Bernard Fox as Colonel Archibald Gracie and Michael Ensign as Benjamin Guggenheim added further texture to the depiction of Gilded Age society. Fanny Brett as Madame Aubert, Martin Jarvis as Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, Rosalind Ayres as Lady Duff Gordon, and Rochelle Rose as the Countess of Rhodes populated the first-class public rooms with figures drawn from the actual passenger list. Jonathan Evans Jones as band leader, Wallace Hartley led the musicians whose final performance became one of the disaster's enduring legends. Third class and crew roles filled out the human panorama. Jeanette Goldstein as the Irish mother, Camilla Overby-Roos as Helga Dahl, Linda Carnes as a third-class woman, Amy Guyper as Trudy Bolt, Rocky Taylor as Bert Cartmel, and Alexandria Owens as young Cora Cartmel illustrated family life. In steerage, Liam Tuohy as Chief Baker Charles Jockin, James Lancaster as Father Thomas Biles, and various lookouts, wireless operators, and engineers completed the operational hierarchy of the ship. Many of these performers were required to work in cold water under physically demanding conditions and to maintain period authenticity in accent, posture, and behavior. Casting directors Marley Finn and Emily Schweber oversaw the extensive search. Finn's earlier identification of both DiCaprio and Winslet proved decisive. The process extended beyond principal roles to hundreds of supporting players, extras, and specialist performers. Authenticity consultants and historians advised on appearance, dialect, and social nuance so that the finished ensemble would feel historically coherent rather than merely theatrical. The supporting ensemble also included dancers for the steerage party sequences, musicians for both formal and informal performances, and numerous uncredited passengers and crew whose collective presence created the illusion of a fully occupied ocean liner. James Cameron himself made an uncredited appearance as a steerage dancer, a small personal signature within the larger tapestry. Physical requirements influenced many casting choices. Actors needed to be capable of performing in cold water tanks, of handling period costumes that restricted movement, and of sustaining emotional intensity across long shooting days. The production's commitment to practical effects and large scale sets meant that performers interacted with real environments rather than purely green screen spaces, placing additional demands on stamina and adaptability. Accent work formed another critical layer. British, Irish, Italian, American, and other regional dialects had to be consistent and historically plausible. Dialect coaches worked with the cast to ensure that class distinctions remained audible and that immigrant voices retained authenticity without caricature. Chemistry tests extended beyond the two leads. Pairings between Rose and Carl, Jack and Fabrizio, the various officers, and the first class social groups were evaluated for believable interpersonal dynamics. The goal was an ensemble that felt interconnected rather than a collection of isolated star turns. The casting of child performers, including the young Cora and other steerage children, required additional care regarding working hours, safety in water sequences, and emotional support. Parents and guardians remained on set, and sequences involving children were scheduled and supervised with heightened attention to welfare. Older actors such as Gloria Stewart and Bernard Hill brought not only professional experience but also a lived sense of historical continuity. Their presence reminded the younger cast of the real temporal distance between 1912 and the late 1990s, reinforcing the gravity of the story being told. The decision to cast real historians and technical experts in small roles further blurred the line between dramatization and documentation. Sagalevich's appearance as himself within the modern storyline is the clearest example, yet similar principles guided the selection of performers for officers and crew whose actions were drawn from survivor testimony and official inquiries. Costume and makeup tests ran parallel to the acting auditions. Actors were evaluated not only for performance but for how convincingly they inhabited the clothing, hairstyles, and physical bearing of their characters. First class passengers required an ease with formal wear and social protocol. Third class passengers needed to convey the physicality of labor and the constraints of limited resources. A rehearsal process varied by role. Principal actors spent extensive time with Cameron refining emotional beats and physical business. Supporting players often rehearsed group sequences, the boarding, the dinner, the steerage dance, the evacuation, so that crowd movement would appear organic rather than choreographed. The sheer scale of the production meant that casting continued well into principal photography. Day players and additional extras were brought in as specific sequences required, always under the same standards of period accuracy and dramatic purpose. Voice casting for ADR and additional dialogue recording followed the same principles of consistency and authenticity. Performers who matched the on-screen actors in tone and dialect were selected to ensure seamless integration. The cumulative effect of these casting decisions was an ensemble that could sustain a 3-hour narrative without fatigue or imbalance. Each major character possessed a distinct silhouette and vocal signature, while the larger population of the ship never dissolved into anonymous background. The result was a living community whose individual stories intersected with the historical catastrophe, making the disaster feel both intimate and immense. In the modern framing sequences, the smaller ensemble of expedition members and Old Rose's family created a quieter, more reflective counterpoint. Paxton Amis, Abernathy, Cascone, and Stewart formed a tight unit whose interactions revealed character through understatement rather than spectacle. Their casting emphasized professionalism, curiosity, and eventual emotional investment in the human dimension of the wreck. Throughout the process, Cameron maintained final authority while relying on Finn and Schreiber to generate options and manage logistics. The director's insistence on chemistry, authenticity, and physical capability shaped every major decision. Alternatives were considered thoroughly, yet the final choices consistently prioritized the specific dramatic and historical needs of each role over pure star power or prior association. The supporting officers and crew, Stewart, Gruff, Phillips, Chapman, Graham, Brightwell, Donachie, and others, created a hierarchical structure that mirrored the real Titanic's command system. Their performances conveyed both the competence expected of professional seamen and the individual responses to unprecedented crises. Casting actors capable of projecting authority under stress was essential to the credibility of the evacuation sequences. First class social scenes depended on performers who could inhabit privilege without self consciousness. Braden, Chatton, Fox, Ensign, Jarvis, Ayres, Rose, and their colleagues supplied the texture of Edwardian high society. Its manners, its hierarchies, its unspoken rules, so that Rose's rebellion would register against a fully realized background rather than a schematic one. Third class sequences required equal care in the opposite direction. Nucci, Barry, Goldstein, Roos, Kearns, Gaipa, Taylor, Owens, and the larger group of steerage players conveyed warmth, resilience, and cultural variety. Their music, dancing, and mutual support established an emotional world that the audience could care about before the disaster struck. The musicians, both the formal band under Evans Jones and the informal steerage players, needed to be credible instrumentalists as well as actors. Their performances, especially the final numbers on deck, demanded musical accuracy alongside dramatic presence. Child and adolescent performers added vulnerability and continuity of family life. Their casting and subsequent management on set reflected the production's awareness of the ethical responsibility involved in depicting historical trauma through young characters. Uncredited and background players completed the illusion of a fully occupied vessel. Hundreds of extras were costumed, directed, and photographed so that public rooms, decks, and corridors never appeared artificially empty. The casting of these roles followed the same standards of period appearance and behavioral authenticity applied to speaking parts. Cameron's own brief appearance as a dancer in the steerage sequence served as both a private joke and a statement of immersion. The director placed himself inside the world he was constructing. The overall casting strategy balanced star power at the center with deep character work in the supporting ranks and rigorous historical fidelity throughout. DiCaprio and Winslet provided the emotional engine. Zane, Bates, Fisher, Stewart, Paxton, Hill, Warner, Garber, Hyde, and the rest supplied the social, professional, and temporal context that made the central romance feel embedded in a larger human story. The result was an ensemble whose collective presence transformed a well known historical event into a densely populated dramatic world. Production development and pre production. James Cameron's interest in the Titanic did not begin with a screenplay or a studio pitch. It began with his lifelong fascination with shipwrecks, a fascination he described in later interviews as something close to obsession. He often referred to the Titanic as the Mount Everest of shipwrecks, a phrase that captured both the scale of the disaster and the difficulty of ever properly documenting it. By the early 1990s, Cameron had reached a point in his career and his personal life where the idea of mounting a real deep sea expedition to the wreck no longer felt impossible. He had spent years pursuing filmmaking after abandoning an early path in the sciences, and the pull toward exploration, toward actually visiting the ship rather than merely reading about it, had never fully left him. The catalyst that pushed this fascination towards something concrete was an IMAX documentary called Titanica, released in 1992, which was built from footage shot at the wreck site. Watching what other filmmakers had managed to capture stirred something in Cameron. He began to look for a way to fund his own expedition to the wreck, and it quickly became apparent that the only realistic way to finance such a costly undertaking was to attach it to a Hollywood production. In other words, the film was, in a very real sense, a vehicle for the expedition rather than the other way around. Cameron later admitted that his primary motivation at this early stage was less about making a movie and more about wanting to see the shipwreck for himself in person at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. To make that happen, Cameron wrote what is known in the industry as a scriptment, a hybrid of a script and a treatment outlining his vision for a Titanic film. He took this document to executives at 20th Century Fox, including Peter Chernin, and pitched the project with a line that would become one of the most quoted descriptions of the film's premise. He described it as Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic. The pitch was, by Cameron's own account, met with skepticism. The Fox executives were not convinced there was a substantial commercial audience for a 3-hour period romance built around a century-old maritime disaster. They had come to expect from Cameron the kind of high-octane action filmmaking he had delivered with The Terminator, Aliens, and True Lies, and a somber historical drama centered on a doomed love affair was a significant departure. Ultimately, the studio approved the project anyway, not necessarily because they were persuaded by the pitch itself, but because they wanted to maintain a long-term working relationship with a director of Cameron's caliber and box office track record. Once the project had a green light, Cameron set about convincing Fox that the expedition to the actual wreck site was not simply a personal indulgence, but something that could be leveraged for the film's benefit, both artistically and promotionally. He argued that shooting real footage of the wreck rather than simulating it entirely with models and computer generated imagery would lend the film a level of authenticity that no amount of visual effects trickery could replicate. He framed the additional expense in blunt financial terms, telling the studio that they could either spend a certain amount of money creating the shots artificially or spend roughly 30% more and go film the genuine wreck. Fox agreed to the added cost, and over the course of 2 years, Cameron organized and led us of deep sea dives to the Titanic's resting place in the North Atlantic. These dives were far from routine tourism. The crew descended to the wreck 12 times over the course of 1995, using submersibles capable of withstanding the immense water pressure found at those depths. The danger was constant and very real. Even a minor structural flaw in a submersible could prove fatal given the crushing pressure at that depth, compounding the physical risk. Adverse weather and sea conditions repeatedly interfered with the shooting schedule, preventing the crew from capturing usable footage on several occasions. During one of the dives, a submersible actually collided with part of the wreck's hull. The impact damaged both the vessel and the ship, scattering fragments of the submersible's propeller shroud across the wreck's superstructure. The collision also caused the external bulkhead near the captain's quarters to collapse, exposing its interior, and damaged the area surrounding the entrance to the grand staircase, an area that would later become one of the most iconic sets built for the film. Beyond the physical hazards, the dives had a profound emotional effect on Cameron and his crew. Descending to the actual wreck site, seeing debris and remnants of the ship scattered across the ocean floor, drove home for everyone involved that they were not dealing with an abstract historical event or a mere backdrop for a love story. They were confronting the site of a real tragedy in which more than 1,500 people had died. Cameron later reflected that working around the wreck for such an extended period instilled in him and his team a powerful sense of the sadness and injustice associated with the disaster, along with a deeper understanding of what the story ultimately needed to communicate. He described feeling a weighty sense of responsibility to convey that emotional truth faithfully, partly because he understood that he might be one of the last filmmakers ever given the opportunity to visit the wreck in this manner. After completing the underwater photography, Cameron turned to the task of actually writing the screenplay. He approached the writing process with the same sense of obligation that had characterized the dives themselves. He wanted the finished film to serve in part as a tribute to the people who had actually died aboard the Titanic, and he spent roughly 6 months researching the ship's crew and passenger manifest in order to understand who these people were and how they had experienced the disaster. From this research, Cameron constructed an extremely detailed timeline covering the voyage and the sinking itself moment by moment, and had this timeline checked and verified by historical experts specializing in the Titanic. This meticulous approach shaped the production from the very beginning. Cameron and his collaborators went into filming with what he called a very clear picture of exactly what had happened aboard the ship on the night it sank. He later explained that this obsessive attention to historical accuracy actually elevated the entire project, pushing the team to aim for what he described as a definitive visualization of the event, as though a camera crew had traveled back in time and filmed the disaster as it unfolded in real life. Cameron's approach to the material was also shaped by an earlier film, the 1958 British production, A Night to Remember, which dramatized the sinking of the Titanic and which Cameron had seen as a young man. Elements of that earlier film clearly influenced his own screenplay. He borrowed, in a fairly direct way, certain dialogue and scene concepts from A Night to Remember, including the depiction of a lively party among the third-class passengers in steerage and the sequence in which the ship's musicians continue to play on deck as the vessel goes down. Central to Cameron's conception of the project was the idea that the sinking of the Titanic had, over the decades, calcified into something like a stock morality tale, a familiar story about hubris and the folly of declaring any human creation unsinkable. Cameron wanted his film to move past that familiar moral framing and instead give audiences something more visceral, the actual felt experience of living through the historical event. He believed that the most effective way to achieve this emotional connection was through the romance between Jack Dawson and Rose David Bukater. In his view, the audience needed characters to fall in love with, so that when that love was ultimately destroyed by the disaster, the audience would genuinely mourn what had been lost rather than simply observing a historical reenactment from a comfortable emotional distance. Cameron summarized his overall philosophy for the project by noting that all of his films were at their core love stories, but that Titanic represented the first time he felt he had achieved the right balance between romance and spectacle. He resisted categorizing it purely as a disaster film, preferring to describe it as a love story layered carefully over real history. The character of Brock Lovett, the present day treasure hunter who opens the film searching the wreck for the fabled heart of the ocean necklace, served a specific narrative purpose in Cameron's design. Lovett represented all those who approached the Titanic disaster from a purely material or historical standpoint without any genuine emotional connection to the human lives lost. Similarly, Cameron created the character of the elderly Rose, the sole survivor able to recount her experience firsthand, specifically to bridge the gap between the present day and the historical tragedy, allowing audiences watching in the 1990s to feel connected to an event that had occurred more than 8 decades earlier. Cameron structured the framing device around the elderly Rose deliberately, wanting the passage of so many decades to feel emotionally palpable and poignant rather than merely serving as a narrative device to bookend the flashback structure. Interestingly, even members of his own cast disagreed about how the film's ending should be interpreted. Both Kate Winslet and Gloria Stewart, who played Rose at different ages, believed that the character dies peacefully at the very end of the film during the sequence depicting her dream or vision of reuniting with Jack. Cameron, for his part, always declined to give a definitive answer, insisting that the interpretation of that final sequence was something each viewer needed to determine for themselves. The production design process benefited enormously from an unusual stroke of good fortune. Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipbuilding firm that had originally constructed the real Titanic, opened its private archives to Cameron's production team, sharing original blueprints that had previously been thought lost to history. This access allowed the filmmakers to work from genuine technical documentation rather than relying solely on photographs and second-hand descriptions. To physically build the ship, Fox acquired a 40-acre plot of waterfront land south of Playas de Rosarito in Mexico and began constructing an entirely new studio facility on May 31, 1996. The centerpiece of this new facility, later known as Baja Studios, was an enormous horizon tank holding 17 million US gallons of water, engineered to provide a 270-degree unobstructed ocean view for the exterior shots of the reconstructed ship. The Titanic replica itself was built at full scale, though production designer Peter Lamont's team removed certain redundant sections of the superstructure and the forward well deck so that the massive structure could physically fit within the tank. These missing sections were later filled in digitally. The lifeboats and funnels built for the production were shrunk by about 10% relative to their true historical dimensions. Only the boat deck and deck were constructed as fully functional, walkable sets. The remainder of the ship's exterior consisted of steel plating built primarily for visual purposes. Hidden within the structure was a 50-foot lifting platform, engineered specifically to allow the ship to tilt during the elaborate sinking sequences later in the film. In addition to the full-scale ship, the production also built a 60-foot 1/8 scale model of the stern section, designed by naval architect J. Cantola, using surviving plans of the Titanic's sister ship, the RMS Olympic. Towering above the model set was a construction crane standing 162 feet tall, mounted on 600 feet of rail track, which served the production as a combined construction platform, lighting rig, and camera mount. The interiors were reconstructed with similarly obsessive attention to historical accuracy, using the authentic blueprints obtained from Holland and Wolff along with period photographs. The production design team rebuilt the ship's interior spaces in painstaking detail. The grand staircase, arguably the most visually iconic set built for the film, was constructed to an extremely high standard of craftsmanship. Though for practical filming purposes it was reinforced with a hidden steel framework and built roughly 30% wider than the original staircase to enhance its visual grandeur on camera and to make it easier to maneuver camera equipment and crew around it. Craftsmen brought in from both Mexico and Britain hand sculpted the ornate wall paneling and plasterwork based directly on the Titanic's original interior designs. Every prop imaginable had to be custom made for the production, since the real Titanic had been a brand new ship at the time of its maiden voyage in 1912, meaning there were no salvageable period objects readily available to simply repurpose. The production accordingly recreated carpeting, upholstery, furniture, light fixtures, chairs, and even cutlery and crockery bearing the White Star Line's crest on each individual piece, all based on original historical designs. To ensure this level of detail remained historically accurate, throughout, Cameron brought on two dedicated Titanic historians, Don Lynch and Ken Marshall, whose job was to authenticate every piece of historical detail incorporated into the production design. Cameron explained that he wanted his cast to genuinely feel as though they were living aboard the real Titanic, so that they could channel that atmosphere and energy into their performances, particularly for the character of Jack, whom Cameron envisioned as an artist whose spirit could truly soar amid the ship's grandeur. Casting the two central roles proved to be a long and involved process. For the role of Jack Dawson, Cameron's original choice had actually been the actor River Phoenix, though Phoenix's death in 1993 made that casting impossible before the film ever reached production. Several established actors were considered outvoted for the role, including Chris O'Donnell and Stephen Dorff, both of whom Cameron ultimately felt were too old to convincingly play a 20-year-old character. Tom Cruise reportedly expressed interest in the role, but his asking price proved too costly for the production. Cameron also considered Jared Leto, who declined to audition for the part, and Billy Crudup, who was invited to audition but turned the opportunity down, choosing instead to appear in the film Without Limits. Crudup later remarked that he did not believe Titanic would have achieved the same level of success had he been cast in the lead role. Actor Jeremy Sisto also completed a round of screen tests opposite Kate Winslet and several other actresses being considered for the role of Rose. Mark Wahlberg met with Cameron to discuss the role of Jack, though Cameron ultimately was not interested in casting him. Other actors who auditioned for the part included Matthew McConaughey, Ethan Hawke, Christian Bale, and Paul Rudd. McConaughey in particular was passed over largely because he was unwilling to alter his distinctive southern accent for the role. It was casting director Marley Finn who first brought Leonardo DiCaprio, then 21 years old, to Cameron's attention. DiCaprio's initial reaction to the project was lukewarm at best. During his first audition, he reportedly refused to seriously perform his assigned romantic scene, choosing instead to goof around rather than commit to the material. Cameron recalled that DiCaprio read through the scene once and then couldn't be persuaded to focus on it again until, in Cameron's telling, one brief moment cut through the reluctance and revealed something special in the young actor's performance. Cameron came away convinced of DiCaprio's ability and told him directly that he had no intention of making the character brooding or neurotic, saying he would not saddle Jack with the kind of nervous mannerisms or physical afflictions that actors sometimes lean on for dramatic effect. Instead, Cameron modeled his vision for the character on the wholesome, plain-spoken leading man charisma associated with classic Hollywood stars like James Stewart and Gregory Peck. When Winslet completed her own screen test opposite DiCaprio, she was reportedly so impressed by his performance that she leaned over and whispered to Cameron that even if he did not ultimately cast her in the role of Rose, he needed to cast DiCaprio as Jack. Taking the role required DiCaprio to pass on the lead role in Boogie Nights, a decision he said decades later in 2025 that he had come to regret, describing Boogie Nights as a defining film of his generation. For the role of Rose, Cameron had a specific archetype in mind, describing the character as resembling an Audrey Hepburn type. As with the casting of Jack, Marley Finn was the one who initially suggested Kate Winslet. For consideration, several other prominent actresses of the era were also considered for the part, including Gwyneth Paltrow, Winona Ryder, Claire Danes, who had recently co-starred with DiCaprio in Romeo plus Juliet the previous year, Gabrielle Anwar, and Reese Witherspoon. Each of these actresses ultimately passed on the role for various reasons. Paltrow, for instance, chose instead to appear in the 1998 adaptation of Great Expectations, while Danes felt the part simply was not right for her. With her competitors out of the running, Winslet mounted what amounted to a determined personal campaign for the role, sending Cameron notes from England on a daily basis, which eventually persuaded him to fly her to Hollywood for a formal audition. Even after her screen test impressed him, Cameron remained uncertain about the casting for some time. Winslet, undeterred, sent Cameron a single rose accompanied by a card signed "From Your Rose," and continued lobbying him persistently by phone, at one point reaching him on a mobile phone while he was riding in his Humvee and insisting to him that she simply was the character and that he had no reason to keep considering other actresses. Her persistence, combined with the strength of her audition, eventually won Cameron over. He later said that Winslet possessed an ineffable quality in her face and in her eyes that convinced him audiences would be willing to emotionally invest in her journey over the course of the film. Winslet herself described her understanding of the character as a young woman with a great deal to offer the world and an open heart, someone eager to explore and have adventures, but who felt at the outset of the story that such a life was permanently out of reach for her. Casting the elderly version of Rose, who narrates much of the film in flashback, presented its own unique challenge. Gloria Stewart, who ultimately won the role, was 87 years old at the time and had to be aged further with makeup for certain scenes depicting the character at an even later stage of life. Cameron instructed Marley Finn to specifically search for retired actresses who had worked during the golden age of Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s. Cameron did not personally know who Stewart was prior to her audition. Another actress from that era, Fay Wray, was also considered for the role, but Cameron ultimately felt that Stewart possessed a particular spark and lucidity that made her the right choice. He described sensing a genuine spiritual connection between Stewart's energy and Winslet's energy, a shared sense of enthusiasm for life that he believed would allow audiences to intuitively accept that the two actresses were portraying the same person at different points in her life. The role of Cal Hockley, Rose's wealthy and possessive fiancé, also went through several rounds of consideration before Billy Zane was ultimately cast. Cameron initially considered Michael Biehn, an actor he had worked with previously on The Terminator, Aliens, and The Abyss, before the role was offered to Matthew McConaughey. Was also in consideration for the role of Jack at various points. Actor Rob Lowe later said that he had also pursued the role of Call. Meanwhile, the role of Molly Brown, the wealthy, unpretentious passenger who befriends Jack, was turned down by singer Reba McEntire, who declined the part because it conflicted with her touring schedule. The role eventually went to Kathy Bates. Filming principal photography officially began on July 31, 1996, with the first days of shooting taking place at Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. This location was used to film the modern-day expedition scenes involving the academic Mstislav Keldysh, the actual Russian research vessel operated by the Shirshov Institute of Oceanology that had served as Cameron's base of operations during his earlier deep-sea dives to the real Titanic wreck. By September of that year, the production had relocated to the newly constructed Fox Baja Studios facility in Rosarito, Mexico, where the full-scale Titanic replica had by then been completed. One particularly notable piece of engineering built into this replica was the poop deck, which was mounted on a hinge mechanism capable of rising from a flat, level position all the way up to a full 90-degree angle within just a few seconds, mirroring in dramatically compressed form the way the real Titanic's stern rose out of the water as the ship broke apart and sank. For the safety of the stunt performers who would be working on this rapidly tilting structure, many of the props used in these sequences were constructed from foam rubber rather than more rigid, potentially dangerous materials. By November 15, the production had reached the point of filming the ship's boarding sequences in Southampton. An unusual and highly specific logistical challenge arose from the physical orientation of the replica ship itself. Cameron had chosen to build his Titanic set facing starboard, a decision informed by a study of historical weather data indicating that the prevailing wind at the real filming location tended to blow from north to south, which would carry the smoke from the ship's funnels toward the stern rather than obscuring the shot. This orientation created a problem, however, when it came to filming the ship's departure from Southampton, since the real Titanic had actually been docked on its port side for that portion of its voyage. To work around this discrepancy without rebuilding the set, the production made the unusual decision to shoot those scenes essentially in mirror image. Every written direction given to the cast and crew, along with the physical placement of props and even certain costume details, had to be deliberately reversed for these sequences, meaning that if a script called for a character to walk to their right, that character would actually have to walk to their left during the actual filming. The resulting footage was then digitally flipped back to the correct orientation during post-production, restoring the proper left-right relationships on screen. To help the cast believably inhabit the world of 1912 high society, the production also hired a full-time etiquette coach whose job was to instruct the actors in the manners and social customs expected of upper-class gentility during the Edwardian era. Despite this effort, a number of critics would later note various anachronisms present in the finished film. Some of the earliest scenes actually filmed between DiCaprio and Winslet involve the now famous sequence in which Jack sketches Rose. For this scene, it was actually Cameron himself who drew the portrait used as Jack's artwork within the film, while Winslet posed for reference wearing a bathing suit rather than being fully unclothed on set. Cameron later reflected that the scene carried an important emotional subtext related to themes of repression and liberation. The idea that posing nude in the context of Rose's constrained, tightly controlled existence within her engagement to Call represented a genuinely exhilarating act of personal for her character. Notably, this sketching sequence was actually the very first scene DiCaprio and Winslet filmed together as actors, despite depicting a moment of considerable emotional intimacy between their characters relatively deep into the story. Cameron acknowledged that this was not a deliberate creative choice on his part, but rather a scheduling necessity. Since the massive interior sets required for many of the film's other pivotal scenes were not yet ready to be filmed, he noted that there was a certain nervous, hesitant energy present in the footage precisely because the two actors had rehearsed the material together but had not yet actually performed anything on camera together, and that if he had been able to choose freely, he might have preferred to schedule that particular scene later in the production once the actors had built up more shared screen experience. Even so, Cameron ultimately felt that the finished scene worked extremely well, despite or perhaps partly because of the circumstances surrounding its filming. The overall filming experience proved to be an extraordinarily demanding and at times grueling one, and it played a significant role in cementing James Cameron's reputation within the industry as an uncompromising and intensely demanding director. He became known during this period, somewhat notoriously, as a relentless perfectionist prone to shouting instructions through a megaphone and walkie-talkie from high atop massive 162-foot construction crane that towered over the set. Kate Winslet, in particular, endured a number of physically taxing and occasionally dangerous experiences during filming. She chipped a bone in her elbow at one point during production, and she has spoken about genuine fears she harbored of potentially drowning in the enormous 17 million gallon water tank used for many of the sinking sequences. She has also said that she was at certain points afraid of Cameron's temper, describing incidents in which he would shout angrily at crew members on set. Bill Paxton, who had worked with Cameron previously and understood his demanding reputation going into the production, commented that with so many people working on the massive set, Cameron simply did not have the time or inclination to focus on winning over each individual crew member personally. Members of the crew reportedly nicknamed Cameron Maije, his own first name spelled backward, joking that this represented something like an evil alter ego that emerged under the pressures of the production. Cameron, for his part, never expressed any regret about the intensity with which he ran his sets, describing filmmaking in fairly stark terms as a kind of war between business considerations and artistic aesthetics. More than 800 crew members ultimately worked on the production at various points. One of the more bizarre and alarming incidents during filming occurred on August 9, 1996, During the shoot involving the academic Mstislav Kaldish in Canada, an unidentified individual suspected by some to have been a disgruntled crew member laced a batch of soup served to Cameron and numerous other members of the cast and crew in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. With the dissociative drug PCP, the incident sent more than 50 people to the hospital. Bill Paxton and Cameron both ate portions of the contaminated soup and were taken to the hospital as a result. Though Paxton reportedly decided fairly quickly that he did not want to remain there amid the chaos, telling Cameron he would rather head back down to the set and simply drink beer instead of sitting through the ordeal at the hospital. Actor Louis Abernathy later described a scene of considerable disorder with numerous affected people rolling around and reporting hallucinatory visual disturbances. Cameron himself vomited before the drug fully took hold, and Abernathy described being shocked by his physical appearance in the aftermath, noting the unsettling way his eyes looked under the drug's influence. Weeks later, on August 27, the Nova Scotia Department of Health formally confirmed that the soup had indeed contained PCP. And the following day, the Halifax Regional Police Service announced it was opening a criminal investigation into the incident. That investigation was ultimately closed without resolution in February 1999. While Cameron speculated that the culprit might have been a crew member who had previously been fired from the production, the individual responsible for contaminating the soup was never identified or caught. The overall filming schedule, originally planned to run for 138 days, ultimately stretched to 160 days, with production officially wrapping on March 23, 1997. Many cast members developed colds, flu symptoms, or kidney infections as a direct result of spending long hours submerged or working in cold water during the extensive tank sequences, and Kate Winslet was among those affected. Following the difficulty of the shoot, Winslet reportedly decided she would not agree to work with Cameron again on a future project unless she was compensated with what she described as a substantial amount of money. Several other individuals departed the production before it wrapped, and 3 stuntmen suffered broken bones over the course of filming. Despite these injuries, an investigation conducted by the Screen Actors Guild concluded that there was nothing inherently unsafe about how the set itself had been constructed or operated. For his part, DiCaprio later said that he never personally felt he was in any genuine danger at any point during the filming process. Cameron, reflecting on his demanding approach, explained that he considered himself to be a demanding presence, both for himself and for his crew, acknowledging that there was something almost militaristic about the way he managed the enormous logistical challenge of coordinating thousands of extras alongside complicated technical and safety requirements, and that he believed a fairly strict management approach was simply necessary when dealing with that scale of production. The financial cost of all this ultimately reached $200 million in filming costs alone, working out to roughly $1 million spent for every minute of the film's eventual screen time. As costs continued to climb, executives at Fox grew increasingly anxious and pushed for the film's runtime, which stood at roughly 3 hours, to be cut down by as much as an hour. Their argument centered on the practical economics of theatrical exhibition. A shorter film could be scheduled for more showings per day, generating more revenue, even though historically longer epic films have tended to perform better during awards season. Cameron flatly refused to make these cuts, reportedly telling the studio in blunt terms that they would need to fire him outright if they wanted the film shortened, and that firing him would essentially require killing him first. Fox executives found themselves in a difficult position. Canceling the project outright would have meant forfeiting their entire massive investment. So, starting over or dramatically restructuring the film was simply not a realistic option at that point. When Cameron first offered to give up his share of the profits as a gesture of good faith regarding the mounting costs, the executives initially dismissed the offer as essentially meaningless, since at that stage they genuinely doubted the film would turn any profit at all. Ultimately, however, they did accept Cameron's offer to forfeit both his $8 million director's salary and his contractual share of the film's initial gross profits. Cameron later explained that the film's budget had increased proportionally by a much larger margin than his previous films, Terminator 2 Judgment Day and True Lies, both of which had seen budget increases in the range of 7 to 8% above their original estimates. Because Titanic had begun with an already substantial budget that then increased considerably further, Cameron said he felt a responsibility as the person ultimately in charge of decisions that affected the studio's finances to help ease that financial burden for the studio in whatever way he reasonably could. He noted that he took this step more than once during the production process, emphasizing that the studio never forced him into these concessions but was nonetheless appreciative when he offered them. Years later, in July 2024, Cameron specifically credited producer John Landau with absorbing much of the direct pressure exerted by the studio during the making of the film, saying that Landau had given everything. He had to secure the time and resources Cameron needed in order to realize the vision he carried in his head for the project. Given the mounting financial pressure, Fox began actively searching for another studio willing to help co-finance the production and share in both the risk and the eventual profits. The studio's first approach was to Universal Pictures, a natural choice given that Universal had previously picked up international distribution rights for Cameron's earlier film, True Lies. After that, production's costs began climbing beyond initial projections. Universal, however, declined the opportunity to partner on Titanic. Fox then turned instead to Paramount Pictures, and in May 1996, the two studios agreed to join forces, building on the successful precedent they had already established, collaborating on distribution for Mel Gibson's Braveheart in 1995. The two companies agreed to co-finance the production and split distribution rights between them. In an effort to recoup a substantial portion of its own $135 million investment in the project, Fox ultimately sold the domestic distribution rights to Paramount, while Paramount in turn provided Fox with an additional $65 million to help fund production. Fox retained the international distribution rights and remained responsible for covering any further budget overruns going forward. But as part of the arrangement, Fox also retained all profits generated from merchandise tied to the film. Once the film had proven itself an enormous financial success at the box office, Fox executive William Mechanic reflected on the studio's decision-making process, recalling that Cameron had essentially framed the choice for them as one between an expensive bad movie and a more expensive but potentially great one, and that the studio, in hindsight, believed they had made the right call. On the technical side of production, Cameron was determined to push the boundaries of what visual effects technology could achieve at the time, enlisting the visual effects houses digital domain and Pacific data images to build upon and extend the digital innovations he had previously pioneered on The Abyss and Terminator 2 Judgment Day. One persistent problem Cameron identified with earlier cinematic depictions of the Titanic disaster involved the way water itself had typically been filmed. Many previous productions had shot practical water effects in slow motion, a technique that tended to look unconvincing and artificial on screen rather than capturing the true chaotic energy of a real disaster. To avoid this pitfall, Cameron directed his crew to film a 45-foot miniature model of the ship as though they were shooting a glossy promotional commercial for the actual White Star Line, aiming to preserve a sense of natural motion and realism in the footage before any digital elements were added. After this practical photography was completed, digital water effects and smoke were composited into the footage, along with digital extras created using motion capture technology. Visual effects supervisor Rob Legato oversaw a process in which the faces of numerous real people, including Legato's own face and the faces of his children, were scanned and used to generate digital extras and digital stunt doubles for use in the film's most dangerous sequences. In addition to the 45-foot miniature, the production also built a separate 65-foot miniature model specifically of the ship's stern section, designed so that it could be repeatedly broken into for filming purposes. This particular miniature was the only one used directly in water for these effects shots. For sequences depicting the ship's engine rooms, the production combined footage filmed aboard the real engines of historic vessel SS Jeremiah O'Brien with miniature support frameworks, while actors performed against green screen backdrops that would later be composited into the finished shots. To help control costs, certain sets, such as the first class lounge, were built only as miniatures integrated with green screen backdrops placed behind the live actors rather than being constructed as full-scale, walkable sets. That same miniature lounge set was later deliberately crushed on camera to simulate the room's destruction during the sinking, and a separate scale model of a first-class corridor was flooded with jets of water for a shot in which the camera slowly pulls back to reveal the flooding hallway. For the interior sinking sequences, the production built an enclosed tank holding 5 million US gallons of water, engineered so that entire constructed sets could be mechanically tilted directly into the water itself to simulate flooding in real time. To depict the flooding of the grand staircase, specifically, the production released 90,000 gallons of water onto the set as it was simultaneously lowered into the tank. This proved more dramatic than intended. The force of the resulting waterfall actually tore the elaborate staircase, set loose from its steel reinforced foundation, though fortunately no crew members were injured in the incident. The full exterior replica of the Titanic, measuring 744 feet in length, presented its own unique engineering challenge when it came time to submerge it, since its sheer mass and weight caused it to act almost like a shock absorber against the surrounding water rather than sinking smoothly. To help get the massive set into the water as intended, Cameron ordered much of the set emptied out beforehand, and he personally smashed several of the promenade windows himself to help facilitate the flooding process. After the dining saloon set had been fully submerged, the production spent 3 additional days filming footage depicting Brock Lovett's remotely operated underwater vehicle exploring the wreck in the present-day sequences of the film. Separately, scenes depicting characters struggling in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic after the ship's sinking were filmed in a different smaller tank holding 350,000 gallons of water. To create the visual effect of frozen corpses floating in the water for these sequences, makeup artists applied a special powder to the actor's skin that would crystallize on contact with water, along with a coating of wax applied to their hair and clothing to simulate ice formation. The climactic sequence depicting the ship's actual breakup and final plunge beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean represented one of the most technically and logistically demanding portions of the entire shoot. It required a tilting, full-size section of the set, along with roughly 150 background extras and around 100 dedicated stunt performers. Cameron had specifically criticized the way earlier Titanic films had tended to depict the ship's final plunge as a relatively graceful, almost peaceful slide beneath the waves, and he made clear that he wanted his own version of the sequence to convey the true terrifying chaos of the actual event as it likely unfolded. This meant having performers appear to fall from an increasingly steep and tilting deck, tumbling hundreds of feet downward and appearing to strike railings and other structural elements along the way. Early attempts to film this sequence using live stunt performers resulted in several minor injuries, prompting Cameron to halt the most dangerous individual stunts before anyone was seriously hurt. To minimize further physical risk to the cast and stunt team, while still achieving the intended visual impact, the production increasingly relied on computer-generated digital performers to depict the most dangerous individual falls. The visual effects work for these complex sequences, notably, was processed using a Linux-based computer operating system, an unusual and forward-looking technical choice for a major studio production of that era. Not every element that had seemed important to Cameron during the earlier stages of writing and pre-production ultimately survived into the final cut of the film. One notable omission involved the SS Californian, the real historical ship that had been situated relatively close to the Titanic on the night of the disaster, but had turned off its radio equipment for the night and consequently never received the Titanic's distress calls, nor responded to the distress flares fired from the sinking ship. A scene depicting the Californian was actually filmed but ultimately cut from the final film. Cameron explained his reasoning for this decision by saying that including the Californian's perspective would have pulled the audience's focus back out toward the broader world beyond the Titanic itself, whereas he wanted the ship functioning as a kind of self-contained metaphorical microcosm for the end of the world to remain fully self-enclosed within the story. He was careful to frame this decision not as some kind of concession made purely for the sake of mainstream commercial filmmaking, but rather as a deliberate creative choice made in service of preserving the emotional truth and focus of the finished film. The ending of the film also underwent significant revision during the editing process. In an earlier version of the script and an early assembly cut, Brock Lovett and his assistant Lizzie discover the elderly Rose alone at the stern of the research vessel and initially fear that she may be contemplating suicide. In this original version of the ending, Rose reveals to Lovett that she has actually possessed the real heart of the ocean diamond necklace all along, having kept it hidden and never sold it, choosing instead to build an independent life for herself, entirely apart from Cole's fortune. She allows Lovett to briefly hold the necklace before telling him that life itself is priceless, and then throws the diamond into the ocean above the wreck. In this earlier version, Lovett having come to accept that his single-minded pursuit of buried treasure was ultimately worthless. Compared to the human story, Rose had just shared with him laughs at his own former foolishness. During the process of assembling the film's first rough cut, Cameron ultimately decided that audiences would no longer be particularly invested in Lovett's personal arc by that late point in the story, and he made the choice to cut this closing scene so that Rose is depicted as being entirely alone when she drops the necklace into the sea. He also felt that keeping Lovett's reaction in the scene risked disrupting the somber, melancholic emotional tone he wanted audiences to carry with them in the aftermath of witnessing the Titanic sinking. Bill Paxton, who played Lovett, agreed with this editorial decision, later saying that he would have gone to considerable lengths to make the original version of the scene work if it had truly been necessary, but that by that point in the story, their character's narrative purpose had already been fulfilled. He offered a broader reflection on the editing process, suggesting that filmmakers who are able to set aside their own ego and personal attachment to specific scenes will generally find that the film itself communicates what it does and does not actually need. Another significant sequence that was filmed but ultimately removed involved a physical confrontation between Jack and Spicer Lovejoy, Call's Valley, which was included in the version of the film shown during its very first test screening. This scene took place after Jack and Rose flee into the flooded first-class dining saloon while attempting to escape Lovejoy, and depicted Cal offering to reward Lovejoy with the Heart of the Ocean necklace if he could successfully retrieve it from the fleeing pair. In the scene, Lovejoy pursues Jack and Rose into the sinking dining room, and Jack ultimately attacks him, smashing his head against a window, an act intended to explain the visible gash later seen on Lovejoy's forehead in the finished film. Cameron made the decision to cut this scene primarily for pacing reasons and also because test audiences reportedly found it somewhat unrealistic that a character would choose to risk his life over material wealth in the middle of a sinking ship. Numerous other scenes beyond these two examples were similarly trimmed from the final cut, largely for reasons related to the film's already substantial overall runtime and pacing concerns. The fictional Heart of the Ocean necklace, one of the film's most enduring visual and narrative symbols, was designed by the London jewelry firm Asprey and Garrard, which used cubic zirconia stones set in white gold to create an Edwardian-style necklace intended to be used as a functional prop on screen. The studio ultimately produced 3 separate physical variations of this necklace, each very similar in overall appearance but individually distinguishable, with the third of these 3 prop versions going entirely unused during filming and only surfacing publicly after the film's theatrical release. These 3 necklaces have since become informally known among collectors and fans as the original prop necklace, the J. Peterman necklace, and the Asprey necklace. Following the enormous success of the film, Asprey and Garrard were separately commissioned to create an authentic, fully realized version of the Heart of the Ocean necklace based on the original design concept, this time using genuine precious materials. The resulting piece featured a platinum setting with a 171 carat heart-shaped Ceylon sapphire surrounded by 103 individual diamonds, featuring a notably larger inverted pear-shaped sapphire with a subtle cleft designed to evoke the shape of a heart, along with a chain incorporating a mixture of round pear and marquise cut white diamonds. This authentic necklace was ultimately donated to Sotheby's auction house in Beverly Hills, where it was sold as part of a charitable auction benefiting the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, as well as a Southern California AIDS charity. It sold to an unidentified private buyer affiliated with Asprey for $1.4 million under an agreement that singer Celine Dion would wear the necklace publicly 2 nights later at the ceremony for the 70th Academy Awards. Post-production. Much of the technical complexity involved in finishing Titanic fell under the umbrella of post-production visual effects, described above, in connection with the extensive use of miniatures, motion capture, digital water simulation, and computer-generated performers for the film's most dangerous sequences. Beyond the visual effects work itself, one particularly unusual post-production task involved correcting the orientation of footage shot during the Southampton departure sequences, since, as noted earlier, those scenes had been filmed in mirror image due to the physical orientation of the replica ship on its set. Editors and technicians were required to digitally flip this footage during post-production in order to restore the correct, historically accurate left-right orientation before the footage could be included in the finished film. The sheer scale and complexity of the post-production process contributed directly to the repeated delays that pushed back the film's intended release date, a subject explored in greater detail in the discussion of the film's theatrical release below. Cameron himself acknowledged publicly during the period when the studios were considering various possible release dates that the special effects work required for the film was proving far more complicated and time-consuming than originally anticipated, making it clear that an earlier proposed release date was simply not realistic given the state of the unfinished effects work at that time. Music. Long before Titanic had a finished script, it already had a musical atmosphere in Cameron's mind. He has said that he actually wrote much of the screenplay while listening to the music of the Irish singer and composer Enya, whose ethereal, atmospheric sound clearly informed the emotional tone he was aiming for in the finished film. Cameron reportedly extended an invitation to Enya to compose the film's score directly, but she ultimately declined the opportunity. With Enya unavailable, Cameron turned instead to composer James Horner to write the film's score. The two men had a complicated professional history together, having previously worked together on Aliens under circumstances that had been, by most accounts, fairly difficult and tumultuous, leading the two to go their separate ways after that collaboration. Despite this earlier friction, their work together on Titanic ultimately proved to be a successful and productive partnership, one that continued in various forms up until Horner's death years later. For the vocal elements woven throughout the score, Horner selected Norwegian singer Sissel Kyrkjebø, widely known simply by her first name Sissel. Horner had become familiar with her work through her album Innerst I Sjelen, and he was particularly struck by her rendition of the traditional song Eg vet e himmerik Eiborg. Before settling on Sissel for the film, Horner reportedly auditioned roughly 30 different singers for the role. Perhaps the single most consequential musical decision made during the making of Titanic involved the film's end title song My Heart Will Go On. Horner wrote this song together with lyricist Will Jennings, and notably, he did so largely in secret, since Cameron had made clear from the outset that he did not want any conventional songs with lyrics included anywhere in the film's score. Singer Celine Dion agreed to record a demo version of the song at the urging of her husband and manager René Angelil. Horner reportedly waited for what he judged to be an appropriate moment before finally playing the finished song for Cameron. After hearing it performed several times, Cameron ultimately gave his approval, though he later admitted he had genuine concerns at the time about potentially facing criticism for what might be perceived as an overly commercial, radio-friendly gesture tacked onto the end of an otherwise serious historical drama. Beyond his own artistic reservations, Cameron also recognized a practical benefit to including the song. He understood that having the film finish with a genuinely successful radio-friendly hit single attached to it could serve as a reassuring, positive signal to the studio executives who remained anxious about the production soaring costs, effectively helping to guarantee that the massively expensive project would actually be allowed to reach completion. The gamble paid off in a significant way. The film's official soundtrack album went on to become the best-selling album of the entire year in 1998, moving more than 27 million copies worldwide. Rel's theatrical distribution responsibilities for Titanic were split between the two studios that had jointly financed the production, with Paramount Pictures handling distribution within the United States and Canada, while 20th Century Fox managed the film's release throughout international markets. Both studios initially expected Cameron to deliver a completed film in time for a release on July 2, 1997, positioning it to take advantage of the lucrative summer blockbuster season, when major studio releases traditionally perform at their strongest. However, by April of that year, Cameron informed the studios that the film's elaborate special effects work was proving considerably more complicated than originally anticipated, making it clear that hitting the planned summer release date simply was not realistic. In response, the studios began considering alternative release windows, including a possible move to late July or the first week of August. Complicating these discussions further, actor Harrison Ford reportedly informed Paramount, a studio that had profited enormously from his work on the Indiana Jones and Jack Ryan franchises, that he would refuse to work with the studio again in the future if Titanic were released in close proximity to his own upcoming film, Air Force One, which was scheduled for a July 25 release.